Hi, I'm Champaka Rajagopal. I'm a member with the YouGovern platform led by Professor Tuna Tussenkoek at the University of Amsterdam. It's a network of scholars, researchers, practitioners, and educators working on urban governance and urban and regional governance. I'm an affiliated professor at the Urban School, Sciences Po Paris, and a visiting faculty at Azim Premji University at Bangalore in India. I'm an urban practitioner, and I lead the Entrepreneurship and Partnerships Lab, which is based out of Bangalore in India. Today, I'd like to share some insights on why it is necessary to study contractual governance in urban development. Urban governance at once brings to our minds municipal corporations, which provide basic services to inhabitants of cities. Normally, we tend to think of elected representatives in local governments who citizens can turn to for demands they have for better access to health, education, sanitation, or transport infrastructure for that matter. The expectation is that municipal corporations, as public bodies, will resolve people's needs in an equitable way. Privatization of the world economy, however, has changed this imagination of access to basic services. In most countries and cities, it's not only governments that cater to needs of cities' inhabitants. Increasingly, it's the private sector, mainly large businesses, which are partnering with governments to jointly make decisions on where to build infrastructure. The involvement of the private sector with the government in providing public access to infrastructure is defined through bilateral contracts, not through direct involvement of the elected representative or the municipal corporation alone. It is contracts which define revenue surpluses for governments and profits for private companies. Contractual conditions and working relationships between parties defines who gets access to resources, where, and at what price. Contractual governance is an under-researched area in metropolitan governance. Much more attention is needed in urban governance on contractual governance studies, and we at the YouGovern network, many of us are engaged in this investigation. What types of projects involve public or public-private contracts? And how does public-private contract, the contractual arrangement, how does that work? The private sector is attracted to large-scale projects which promise profits and secure clientele with governments. So contractual governance is mainly relevant to large-scale infrastructure projects. These may include transport projects such as expressways, which connect cities at the metropolitan level or much larger scales, cross political boundaries, for instance, airports, railway stations, water sector projects, and so on. In projects where public and private sector parties are partners, the public sector generally provides land in lieu of equity. The private party finances the design, construction, and implementation of the infrastructure project. The private party manages and operates infrastructure facilities through long-term contracts, and these contracts span about 30, 60, or even longer, 90 years sometimes. During this time, the private party generally collects user charges to get returns on the capital it invests on project construction and design and construction. Projects need to be therefore at scale in order to make sure that there are ample number of users of infrastructure projects. More the users, more the collection of tariffs and profits. Also, governments promote projects financed through private funding in order to provide high quality infrastructure to businesses which are interacting with international markets. So for example, in the city of Bangalore, where I come from, there are tolled expressways within the city which provide dedicated access to the IT clusters in the city. Now, the tariffs for these facilities are generally higher than those levied by municipal corporations for providing basic services. So private companies tend not to focus on investing in places where users cannot afford to pay higher tariffs. So what's the problem here? It's clear enough for us. It is good that governments rely on the private sector to invest in high-quality, large-scale infrastructure, which catalyzes other markets, isn't it? It appears to be that way. In principle, having the private sector invest in high-quality infrastructure and charge users higher prices makes sense. However, these projects are not entirely financed by the private company. The private company offers about 20 to 30% of its own equity. The remaining is financed through loans it takes mainly from public banks and also to some extent from private lending agencies and private sector banks. It pays back the loans over the course of the contract during project operations and the maintenance period. Now, problems arise when the company does not have enough number of users and it is unable to pay back its loans on time. If the infrastructure facility does not receive the planned number of users, then the contractual agreement faces risks because the company involving public and private contracts undergoes losses which build up over time. The cost of non-repayment of loans goes up over time. A bigger problem is that the public-private contract, within a public-private contract, it is not clear who bears the cost of risks. Private companies and lending agencies tend to go insolvent or bankrupt. While it may not always be the case, it is quite often national or subnational governments which bear the cost of these bankruptcies, which are transferred back onto the taxpayer. The private party with greater bargaining capacities tends to negotiate risk allocation arrangements so that their companies are spared of financial losses or risks. After all, firms and businesses exist in order to mitigate or minimize their own risks and maximize their profits, although the meaning of profits could be much larger than just monetary profits. But the purpose of existence of firms, as firm theory tells us, is to sort of mitigate their own risks and maximize their own benefits. Now, the governance of these risks is dependent on the relationships between public and private partnering agencies. A state which has greater capacities to negotiate contractual clauses with its private partner to deliver its own welfare-istic goals and agendas has possibly better abilities to manage public financial risks. While there are several innovations in public contracts and public-private partnership contracts to address public risks, we need to understand these relationships better and propose interventions as practitioners to reduce public risks. More and more countries, especially where governments are promoting economic growth through large-scale infrastructure development, are adopting these complex public-private partnership models. That's why the focus on research in contractual governance is important and urgent. Now, what is the current literature on contracts in urban studies? There is at present an emerging body of work on contracts in urban studies. To understand the problem of contracts, urban research needs to rely on scholarship outside of the domain of urban studies and urban planning and governance. There's a greater body of work on public contracts and public-private contracts in microeconomics, for instance, where scholars discuss how rigid public contracts or flexible public contracts can directly or indirectly invite politicians to opportunistically claim public resources such as public monies or infrastructure assets. Urban scholars have primarily also, in the space of urban studies, have examined new institutional arrangements of privatization, but these are mostly from the macro level of policy shifts introduced by national and subnational governments. In their studies, scholars from urban development studies, for instance, tend to mainly view liberalizing states as pro-business in nature. Entrepreneurial states, which are pro-business in nature, some scholars have argued, are driven to promoting new institutional arrangements such as mission-led special purpose vehicles, public-private partnerships, or special economic zones, which exclude democratic oversight by design. However, mega projects and infrastructure projects driven by entrepreneurial states in pursuit of growth, which are driven largely by financial gains and financial ends, were not necessarily, as we've seen, contractual governance produces large-scale risks, produces projects which are debt-ridden. So these models of privatization are not necessarily producing the financial outcomes that governments sought. Mega projects seem to produce risks for states rather than surpluses for governments or profits for private companies. So I was curious to understand how entrepreneurially driven states were producing risks on projects they set out to undertake in order to catalyze growth. How come they ended up making so much of losses if these states were actually entrepreneurial in nature? So to understand the nature of the state at the micro level of projects, I argue it's essential to understand contractual governance. Generally, engineers, project management specialists, and others are involved in studying project management. However, not many scholars have in fact studied the problem of long-term contracts in the context of public-private partnerships, particularly in the Indian context. And my research contributes to this effort, and I've been involved with YouGovern on many of these explorations over the last several years. What we've seen is governments are promoting governance arrangements which are hinged on contracts, essentially garnering narrow revenue and performance gains as opposed to accountability towards economic growth, jobs, and welfare. And so we argue that it's more and more essential for us to investigate some of these relationships between public and private sector agencies and partnering agencies within instruments of privatization.